In the wake of my Avowed review, and even before that, I've been thinking for a long time about the extremely seemingly negative consequences of what happens when a studio that used to be independent gets bought. Now, I'm not claiming necessarily there's a direct cause here that you get bought and all of a sudden your games turn to slop or the quality is dramatically reduced, but it is very difficult, to my mind, to not see the connection, and the strong correlation at least, between studios that used to be independent, that used to put out stellar work that we are still talking about today, even though it's been 10 or 15 years later, and the work they put out after they've been acquired by a much larger entity, such as Microsoft or EA. And I think in this case, in light of Avowed, there are two classic examples here. And although I did enjoy aspects of Avowed, and for me personally it's been fun, and I like the game, I think overall it is a very average game, and it's not reflective of the old Obsidian quality. Now, there are a lot of reasons for this, obviously. It's not the same team that's worked on Avowed, the team that originally worked on Pillars. They don't have the same writers. The director was different. The person who directed the art, wink wink, was different, and so on and so forth. But overall, if you just look at the trend of Obsidian games, ever since they were acquired by Microsoft way back in 2018 now, the quality has steadily been going down. The only exception that comes to mind is Pentiment, which was a personal passion project and a very small game indeed, made by Josh Sawyer and his crew. But generally speaking, the quality of Obsidian games has gone down. I've heard good things about Grounded, for example, but it's a very specific type of game, and at the end of the day, there's nothing like New Vegas, there's nothing like the original Pillars games, there's nothing like Tyranny, and I need to remind people, the Tyranny IP is owned by Paradox. It is owned by Paradox, which is why we will never ever see another iteration of that game, no sequel, no nothing. So bear that in mind, because a lot of people think Obsidian owns the Tyranny IP. They do not. Now, to get back to the topic, it just seems to be such a strong correlation when you observe the gradual degradation of the quality of games in concert with the acquisition of these studios by huge entities such as Microsoft and EA. And the same can easily be said about BioWare, right? You could argue, rather convincingly, that the beginning of the end for BioWare was the acquisition by EA. Now, I'm not arguing that the quality of the games itself is EA's fault per se. It's just a correlation, because yes, BioWare as a team, as a studio, has put out a lot of trash, a lot of slop, especially Dragon Age The Veilguard, which had a lot of mismanagement, which only partially was related to EA. But generally speaking, you observe this trend of high-quality, story-driven RPGs that really had you hooked because the writing was good, the characters were compelling, and the systems were really interesting, i.e. the combat and what have you. And you end up with something like Dragon Age The Veilguard, or it becomes extremely watered down, such as with Avowed, despite me personally liking the game. At the end of the day, I did not recommend the game. I told all of you that you could only enjoy the game if you played Pillars and liked Pillars, and if you're interested in the game, you should wait for a deep sale on Steam or GOG. That's what I said, because I'm honest about that. The overall quality of Avowed does not reach the level of previous Obsidian titles. And these are but two examples in a sea of many examples. I could go on about several other studios, but it simply drives home the point. There seems to be a very clear connection and a strong correlation between being owned by a large entity and no longer being independent. And what that connection is, what that correlation is, what the causal mechanism is in particular, is unknown. We're left to speculate. But at the end of the day, we have to speculate, because to my mind, in my opinion, in my view, every time a big dude buys a little dude, to put it in plain terms, the little dude gets really, really sick and eventually ends up dying. And I really don't want to see that for future studios, or studios as they exist in their current incarnation. And given this nigh undeniable fact, at least to my mind, you can understand rather easily why someone like Sven Finke fights tooth and nail to maintain the overall independence of Larian Studios. Now, it is true that Tencent owns 30% of Larian, but nonetheless, Sven Finke and his wife still have the major say in the company because they own 70%. And the same is true of Owlcat Games, or better put, the CEO who founded the studio owns the studio. And look how well the studio has done. And I am 99% sure that if one day Larian were to be sold off, then it would no longer be Larian. Or if Owlcat were bought by a larger entity, it would almost certainly become something less than it is now. And even though I'm not weighing in too much into the drama and problems of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, you can make an argument for the fact that Warhorse Studios, having been bought by a large entity, has changed. Now, I'm not denying the quality of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2. Based on all the reports and based on the people I know, it's an excellent game. But the ethos of the game and the philosophy behind the game has changed. Why this is, we don't know, you can only speculate. Is it because Warhorse themselves changed? Or is it for other reasons? Who knows? I'm not going to speculate here. But I can tell you there is one common thread in all these situations, and that is, if you're an independent developer, you need money rather badly. And that was definitely the case with Obsidian, because I know the history of Obsidian reasonably well. Back in the day, Obsidian was scrounging around to get funding to make games, and more importantly, to pay their developers. And if you've been going on for years, trying to find opportunities here and there, and just barely making it, barely getting by, yes, they're putting out interesting games, but they tend not to be blockbuster hits, they tend not to sell overwhelmingly well. If you're engaged in this type of activity, which is basically a form of reluctant begging, it makes sense financially at least, that you would say, hey look, Microsoft is offering us money, they're offering us the opportunity to pay for our games, and more importantly, to pay for the employees' wages that make the games. Well, what are you going to do in that situation? Steadfastly refuse the proposal, the acquisition? No. People want to, understandably, not worry about paying rent, not worry about being able to afford groceries and what have you, and they don't want to worry about funding for their games. But for whatever reason, and we can only speculate as to why, once Microsoft acquired Obsidian, the quality of their games has steadily gone down. And it's impossible to ignore. And the same applies to BioWare, and the same applies to a lot of studios. And what is the moral of the story? What is the lesson to be taken here? Well, I'm not so sure, because it seems to me that a lot of studios are caught between a rock and a hard place, basically. On the one hand, they seem to produce their best work when they're independent, when they can do what they want to do, when they're not owned by somebody else. But on the other hand, I notice that when they are owned, when they don't have to worry about funding or money, they seem to produce lesser quality. They seem to produce games that are just objectively worse in virtually every metric. It applies to so many studios, and given this, I feel I have to weigh in here on a particular side, and even though it's 100% not my decision to make and I'm not in their shoes, and I don't have to worry about their particular situation as developers, I would say at the end of the day, all in all, it's much better to stay independent. And you can see the proof in the pudding in the sense that Larian has struggled mightily, on the verge of bankruptcy, to stay independent, to not be beholden to powerful entities that, although could certainly help them financially and ease the burden of salaries and being able to pay for development, would almost certainly lead to ruination and corruption of the principles of the studio, and the people in the studio perhaps too, who made the good games that they made. And likewise with Owlcat, same story. It's a very difficult type of tightrope line to walk. I understand that, because you need a publisher, you need money to back you up at the end of the day. But when you look at the long-term consequences of what happens when you become acquired, it does not bode well and it doesn't look good. So if you're a developer and you want to listen to little old me on YouTube rant about this, I'm telling you, it's not worth being bought out. It's not worth selling off your studio for the comfort. Because something else, whatever it might be, however you want to phrase it, something gets lost along the way when studios are bought up by these huge entities that, frankly speaking, only care about profit and only care about one thing. So, put simply, stay independent if you can. It's going to be much better for the longevity and health of your company, in my humble opinion. If you can produce quality work and quality games, people will hear about it. People will play those games. It's like they used to say, if you build it, they will come. You don't need the corpos. And with that said, I am done with my little rant here. But as always, if you like my videos and you like my takes, you can leave a comment, like, share, and subscribe. It's much appreciated as it really helps out the channel. Thank you very much indeed for watching, and I will check you out next time. Take care.